From the Toronto Star, I'm Reggie Mudler, and this matters. That was the sound of the crowd at the Ultra Music Festival in Taiwan last week. Looking at the images, there were thousands of people, many without masks, bopping along together to the DJ's beats. With no active cases in over 200 days, Taiwan can enjoy things like music festivals, and is a sign of hope that we may one day get there too. For many of us, going to concerts is equally a distant memory, and one of the things we hold out hope for when a more normal world returns. The question is, will enough venues remain open and alive for us to enjoy that day? According to the Canadian Independent Venue Coalition, 90% of concert halls and venues are at risk of shutting down forever. So far, there has been some support from the government in terms of financial programs and tax relief, but the situation is not looking good. Toronto has seen the Mod Club recently close, Sneaky D's announced it may move, and beloved venues in other cities, like Logan's in Victoria, call it quits. Is there any sweet music at the end of this dark tunnel? To discuss this, we are joined by Jonathan Bunce, aka Jonny Dovercourt. He is the co-founder and artistic director of the Wavelength Music Series, a non-profit organization. He's also the author of Any Night of the Week, a D.I.Y. history of Toronto music from 1957 to 2001, which is also now a podcast. He's also been in a bunch of bands, run venues, and pretty much done it all from a putting on shows perspective in town. Jonny, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks, Raju.
Okay, so I know you and I both love concerts, and along with movie theaters and restaurant and bars, live music venues are becoming endangered due to this pandemic. But let's set the stage for this. You just wrote a history of music venues in this town from a certain period. Even pre-pandemic, venues in this town were facing all sorts of issues, right?
That's true, yeah. And my book is sort of not so much a history of venues. That wasn't really the intention. It was more like I wanted to write a history of homegrown Toronto music, about local music and the local bands that sort of define Toronto. And the venues really became the theme that came out of it, is of the sort of cultural infrastructure that supported homegrown music. It was our live music venues that were always the most consistent and strongest element of that network. And even prior to the pandemic, I'd say that this sort of robust network of music venues, which had been strong for decades, it was really starting to crack in the last sort of 5 years, or 3 to 5 years prior to 2020. Starting around, especially around 2016, 17, you saw a bunch of venues start to close all at once. It was even termed a vanishing venues crisis. And I kind of used that as the framing point for the very first line of the book. In the beginning of 2017, we saw 7 or 8 venues all close within the space of a few months. You had the Silver Dollar and the Comfort Zone close, and the Hideout, the Hoxton, Soy Bomb HQ, the Central, Holyoke, Hughes Room. And a lot of these were sort of smaller niche venues that served a specific community. Some of these were D.I.Y. spaces that were off the grid and maybe not officially sanctioned spaces. So you definitely saw like in the last few years, these spaces that served a small community or a dedicated community or maybe served one genre were starting to close down. They couldn't make a go of it financially. And everyone was wondering what was going on and why the city wasn't stepping in to protect them. And definitely, I think that there's a lot of factors at work there. And the biggest one being just the cost of occupancy and property values rising in the city due to gentrification and development pressure being the primary one, but also audience behavior changing and people staying in more. People in the winter, Netflix was the big competition. In the summer, Trinity Bellwoods became the big competition. The idea of going out to a bar and watching a band play and drinking a few beers became maybe less of an attractive entertainment option compared to other things. And that also ties into the increased cost of living, especially in the city. For younger people, for someone who's 25 years old now versus when we were 25, it's just a lot more expensive to go out than it was a couple of decades ago.
Okay, those are a great sort of table setter. Where are things at right now? Obviously, we can't spend time indoors. The Mod Club recently shut down. Sneaky D's is a place that may be going because of condos. I know some places are hosting some live streams. What are you hearing from the venue operators out there right now?
There's a lot of worry and a lot of sadness and a lot of concern, and it's all very understandable. I mean, the numbers tell the story. It's the current rates, like 95% of venues are expected to close their doors within the next year. People are holding out hope that the news about the vaccine is going to result in a return to traditional live activity, hopefully by next fall, is what I've heard is sort of, optimistic estimates. But a lot of all the traditional sort of touring circuit is really all shut down, and tours are constantly being canceled and rescheduled and canceled again. I think that live streaming is definitely a way for some of these venues to keep their spaces active. But because the traditional venue model is so based around alcohol sales as a primary source of revenue, this kind of activity might, especially if like a grant-funded organization can come in and do a live stream, or it's an act with a big enough draw to sell some tickets for live streaming, which is still kind of a challenging prospect for a lot of artists, at least the ones that are below a certain threshold of popularity. Those are just kind of stopgaps. And really, most of these venues are on life support thanks to various different government emergency funds. There's things like, thankfully, the Canada Emergency Fund that was rolled out in support of the arts and cultural sector. In the summer, it was opened up to support the more for-profit venues. Previously, so your traditional arts and cultural funding in Canada was only available to not-for-profits. That's one of the main reasons why Wavelength is not-for-profit. And so we can access funding, which gives us a lot more freedom, flexibility, and protection from things like this, and not being subject to the sort of vagaries of the market. Traditional music venues the majority of them are for-profit businesses that have not been able to access this kind of funding. So that was a big win, I think, for a lot of these venues to be able to access this funding, to at least keep their doors open, to pay their rent, to keep paying their staff. And so right now we see music venues just on this emergency life support for the foreseeable future.
I want to talk about some of those other supports that are out there and whether they are actually helping. So obviously you mentioned CERB, the Heritage Canada stuff, which I think you mentioned, which is now opened up for more profit venues. Toronto City Council, I believe, let performance hall owners get a 50% rebate on their property taxes. But I think really a lot of these venues are relying on the kindness of landlords. Is that fair to say?
Yes. I don't know as much as what's happening with the commercial landlord situation. You might want to refer to a venue owner like maybe Sean Bowering from the Garrison might be able to speak more about what's happening with commercial landlords. But I know that there have been some issues with what's called the CERCA, because it's a voluntary program for landlords to opt into rather than a mandatory program. So the situation really seems to vary wildly from venue to venue and operator to operator.
But from what you're hearing, are people seeing some of these funds? Yes,
it does seem like there has been some success in some of these independent for-profit venues, at least accessing emergency funds. And I think that the CERB and also the wage subsidy has also been really helpful in terms of keeping the lights on for now.
While we are talking about money, it's one of these things that obviously there's the arts and cultural benefit here, but as a sector, I believe the economic impact of shows, according to the City of Toronto and the Canadian Live Music Association, has an economic impact of $850 million every year, and it supports about 10,000 jobs. So this is an important thing to this city's fiscal health as well, right?
Absolutely.
Could more be done right now?
I don't think there's anything that can be done beyond keeping the emergency funds flowing. There are suggestions in the recent revenue support of redirecting funds, perhaps from other programs like infrastructure programs. These venues are really important culturally and economically, and they need to be preserved no matter the cost. And I think that the danger of them going away, of these venues closing their doors within the next year, is immeasurable. Potentially, I think, decimate an entire generation of new music. To bring it back to my book, and that's the thing that really made Toronto music so important, was that homegrown music that was written and created here, really became one of our main cultural exports. I think that you could argue that, alongside literature, local music is probably Toronto's biggest cultural export. And, you saw several generations of bands and artists and songwriters and music makers and DJs, MCs. A lot of them came out of this network of live music venues or clubs. And I use the term live to include DJ performances as well as your traditional bands. And, from your sort of basement D.I.Y. spaces that a drum and bass DJ Collective would have hosted legal raves at in the 90s. You can go going back to the 60s coffee houses of Yorkville that, supported the folk scene. These network of venues was really the first step that allowed artists to take risks, that allowed them to find their voice, that allowed them to connect with an audience and really step up to that next level. And without those spaces, those independent spaces that are usually under 200 capacity, there's not going to be anywhere for people to perform, and there's not going to be anywhere for original artists to develop that craft. Beyond, live streaming is fine, and we've been doing it. I think it's definitely an interesting format and then really a very creative format that a lot of people are only just sort of developing and exploring all the potentials of. I think that it's going to be really, really difficult to replace the sense of community and the sense of interaction and the sense of creativity you get from bringing people together in a room in physical space.
We'll be right back. Can't wait for the next concert that I go to. And it's funny, I keep thinking about the ones that I've missed that have been postponed. I think the other thing is we've reached sort of the crazy scheme part of this as well, where people are trying to come up with ideas. Exactly. So I want to bounce a couple off of you. Let's start with one of the biggest ticket sellers in the world, Ticketmaster. I think in Variety and Billboard, they put out their plan, which essentially, while trying to control a lot of the things they can, one of the things that they're really hoping for is some proof of vaccination or potentially even a test 3 days prior to the show. I know you read about it. What do you think about this?
Well, I think that Ticketmaster very quickly retracted this or clarified the story that Billboard issued, which is that this was just one model they were suggesting for the event organizers they support to use to open safely. I think that's really, speaking with my promoter hat on, I think what everyone is trying to do is think about how and when can we reopen safely? Will the vaccine be a magic bullet? Who knows? Hopefully it will, but we have no idea how long it's really going to take to be distributed to everybody. And I think that in terms of the wacky schemes, we're only starting to think about, well, what's the politics of post-vaccination going to look like? Are people going to walk around with a big V on their shirt saying, I got vaccinated? I think that the proof of vaccination could get really dicey when it comes to things like reopening venues. I can understand why an event organizer would want to see that proof in order to admit people to a space safely. To its credit, the live music sector has been very prudent and for the most part has been avoiding situations that are unsafe and has been amazing about complying with public health guidelines. So I think that it's going to be interesting. There's going to be situations where it doesn't work. There's going to be situations where people are upset if they're asked to provide proof of vaccination. And I guess for me, my biggest fear is this is something like the Ticketmaster app that they were proposing. Something like that, those kind of measures add fuel to the sort of anti-vaxxer movement. That's what would be my biggest fear, is that the anti-maskers join forces with the anti-vaxxers to prove that this is all just sort of some kind of diabolical plan for control. So I think that, we have to be really careful about demanding that level of scrutiny and policing.
Okay, the other one that I think all of us music nerds were talking about was reported in the New York Times, and there's a former music executive named Mark Geiger who has a ton of money and now is talking about a plan to potentially buy 50% of a number of the independent music clubs across the US just to sort of get them through this. What do you think about that idea?
Yeah, so Geiger is a guy who has been working as a booking agent for WME for a while. So formerly William Morris Agency, like a big high-level booking agent, books a lot of pop stars. And he's also one of the co-founders of Lollapalooza. So he has a reputation as being a disruptor in the industry. So I think he had a plan. He had amassed $75 million from an investor to buy up struggling venues, own 51% of the business, to the idea to being to save them and to keep it afloat. And he's calling this venture Save Lives. I think it's interesting. I think that obviously we're all looking for a savior right now, right? I think every struggling venue would sort of be very happy to have someone swoop in and save the day and keep them afloat. I guess, the fear is, is that giving up control? Does that keep things independent? I think the sort of one of the great things about independent venues is the fact that they are all kind of scrappy and DIY and grassroots, a lot of small businesses who are family-run businesses maybe, or just businesses owned by music lovers who are doing this not to make money, but because they love music, and they've found music as being the thing that keeps them happy and engaged and has given their life purpose. And that element of passion-driven business is really what makes these venues special. And that's everywhere. It's a worldwide phenomenon. You see venues like this in Australia and England and in Asia and obviously across North America. And the States really, sort of, I think in some ways it was a bit of a leader in terms of that network of small venues, the independent venues, especially really, you think about places like the Lounge Acts in Chicago, or going back to CBGBs in New York, and venues in Austin and San Francisco, bottom of the hill. There's so many right across the States that are sort of like became iconic. And so it's really great, the idea of saving them. But I think that in some ways it kind of goes against their nature, and no one wants to be swept up into a kind of mini Live Nation conglomerate. I think what would be interesting is if Geiger was able to turn it into something that was more like the Music Venues Trust in the UK, to turn it into something with a charitable mandate, maybe something based on a community land trust model. Because I think the fear is that the optics of someone swooping in and buying up a bunch of distressed assets and flipping them is pretty bad. If there's a charitable mandate to keep these spaces active as live music spaces and allow the operators to still program them independently without corporate interference from above, then it could be win-win.
Did you see the photos going around about the Ultra Music Festival in Taiwan?
I have not, sorry.
Okay, well, basically this was a massive concert that took place in Taiwan with a bunch of DJs, and it looked like normal times. It looked like a big concert. Basically, they hadn't had a case in 200 days, so they had just had a full-on concert. And I think this is one of those things that the photos went viral because it brought back a lot of good memories for people.
That's nice to hear.
It's happening somewhere in the world. Johnny, I think this has been pretty great for us. I know that you've toured a lot. There's been some news about venues that have closed. I know Victoria, a bunch of bands were talking about Logan's there. There was the Mod Club here. Anything that you're going to miss? Any place that's gone right now that you're thinking about because of all these places are in jeopardy?
Oh my gosh. There's so many beloved spaces across Canada. I really think about Thunder and Lightning in Sackville. I think about the Commodore Ballroom in Vancouver. I think about Casa del Popolo in Montreal. In Toronto, there's so many iconic venues that it's hard for me to choose favorites. Obviously, I want Sneaky D's to be there forever. I know it maybe can't live at College and Bathurst forever. And obviously, the Horseshoe and Lee's and Lula Lounge. These spaces are all really vital and they all really, serve important communities and create those spaces for artists to step out of the basement and to connect with other artists and with audiences. But beyond that, they also really create our memories, our collective memories of the city. And I think that's been the thing in the last, how long is it now? 8 months? The last 8 months of things being shut down. I think there are people have, I wouldn't say retreated to, but have really explored nostalgia and looking back to the times and spaces and venues and concerts of the past that really, really were important for them in terms of them not just discovering music, but also discovering their sense of selves and their sense of community. And that's what I fear we're going to lose. I feel bad for the 20-year-olds of today, and they're going to look back on 2020. They're not going to have shows at the Rivoli or the Drake to think about as being their formative memories. Are they going to have Zoom parties or Twitch parties? Maybe that's really amazing for them. And maybe in 20 years' time, Gen Zs will look back on COVID with nostalgia as well. I think that it's really important to bring people together in space, and we need to preserve these spaces for the future because they define who we are.
Well, Johnny, I completely agree with you. I hope there is a vaccine soon, and I hope that you and I can one day enjoy another concert in this city together. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks so much, Raju. It's great to speak with you.
Jonny Dovercourt is co-founder and artistic director of the Wavelength Music Series and nonprofit organization. He is also the author of Any Night of the Week, a D.I.Y. history of Toronto music from 1957 to 2001. That's it for today. Thanks so much for joining us. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Raju Budler, Adrian Chung, and Saba Etizaz. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattenden, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.